Anything else, sir? Okay, there was a gentleman at the back. There's a lady there. Please go ahead, sir.
Good evening. My name is Sanjay Sal from DSMS. My question is, in the month of November, we all experienced a phenomenon called demonetization. It had a great impact on the economy, and IMF expects the GDP will grow by only 6.6% in fiscal year 17, which will be less than China. And the same will have an impact in fiscal year 18 too. So my question is, can you highlight few measures which government have taken to mitigate the impact of demonetization?
All right. So I think that's an excellent question you have asked. You see, if you break down the nominal GDP that's been assumed, that's 11.75, and if you take the inflation assumption to be 4.25 to 5%, that's a consumer price index, your GDP numbers could vary somewhere from 6.75 to 7.5%. Again, this is a range I'm giving you, but we finally don't know. But the more important question is, how realistic are these numbers? And I'm going to ask the panelists to respond, and I'm going to add a question to this, even the inflation assumption. And here I draw your attention to what was said in the economic survey by Dr. Arvind Subramaniam. He cautioned that the prices of milk, sugar, potatoes, and onions could rise, as the prices of pulses did in 2015-16. That the tacit assumption that the consumer price index in 17-18, the next financial year, would be contained in that range of 4.25% and 5.2%, how realistic it is, especially if you assume that international oil prices are expected to firm up. Yes, sir.
I think, international oil prices are a matter of concern, and I think it's anybody's guess. But the overall expectation, those of us who follow the international oil market, is that it is likely to go up, but not very much though, because now, unlike the earlier situation, the US has the fracking oil. And therefore, that can dampen any effort by the OPEC countries to raise prices disproportionately. So I see that may be environmentally bad, but purely in terms of oil prices, that could put a downward pressure on oil prices. So that the range which Arvind Subramanian talks about seems reasonable. I think that would
okay.
be, yeah.
Dr. Roy, would you like to add to that? And especially if the questioner believes whether the assumption of GDP numbers, how realistic are those?
You see, first I will take up the last question, what is happening to GDP. If you look at the revised GDP numbers which have just come, it's about, in 15-16, we were supposed to have grown by 7.9%, which earlier used to be 7.6, which is what we had in mind. Now, so the base has gone up. So as a result, in 16-17, when we said in the economic survey we'll be growing at 6.5, it may come down a little bit. Whether there is a demonetization impact or not, even Arvind in his economic survey says that if you sort of do put any trend to what was the quarterly growths, you will see a deceleration. So that deceleration is already there, and on that demonetization has come, plus this base change has taken place. So what will happen in 16-17, you will see possibly closer to 6% than 6.5%. But since it is becoming less, so in 17-18, where they are taking 6.75 to 7.25 or 7.5, something like that, so that will be surely met, if not exceeded, because here the base has in 16-17 has come down. So that will be met. So I think to that extent, the calculations are right. And now if you look at from the nominal GDP point of view, if you have 6.5 to 7% growth over there, and your inflation is around 4 to 5%, doesn't come down to 3% or stabilize at 3% that we have seen in CPI, which came out recently, 3.2%. But non-core CPI, the core CPI is growing at 5%. Today's WPI shows that it is growing at more than 5%. So overall 4 to 5% in the national income deflator you will get, the GDP deflator. So add that, you will get 11.75%, and then you have the buoyancy, you will get the tax collection, etc. So there won't be too much of a problem.
Okay. Would you like to add to that, sir? All right. On demonetization, before I take a question from you, madam, I'm tempted to lighten the mood a little bit, you know. We were first talked about demonetization, curbing counterfeit currency, curbing terror financing, black money, then we talked about cashless economy. So if you will excuse me, I will crack a very silly joke. Demonetization explained in very simple terms. Teacher asks student, अगर एक आम के पेड़ में 10 केले लगे हैं और उनमें 7 अमरूद तोड़ लिए तो कितने अंगूर बचे? स्टूडेंट, सर 9 हाथी। वाह, तुम्हें कैसे पता चला? सर क्योंकि मैं आज लंच में गोभी की सब्जी लाया हूँ। मॉरल ऑफ द स्टोरी, रोज ब्रश करो वरना पेट्रोल महंगा हो जाएगा। All right, madam. Question is yours.
Sangeet, member of the Bombay Chamber. You said that the budget is a political statement. Very rightly so.
Yeah.
The budget is a political statement. Now, since the parliamentary election and even before that, we are seeing that women are increasingly coming out more than men to vote. And this has been seen in the parliamentary election, Punjab election, West Bengal, name it, in the last few elections, it's consistently a trend. UP, I mean, the earlier government, I remember, gave relief on custom duty on Jamdani sarees to women. What has this budget got for women?
If you ask my opinion, this budget has, there's been a lot of talk about gender budgeting, but I regret to inform you, madam, I don't see anything specific for women. If you look specifically under the heads, women, child welfare, other than that scheme which was announced on the 31st of December, the pilot scheme which has been now spread up about pregnant women getting 6,000 rupees if they have institution delivery, I personally don't see anything for women, but my colleagues here may have a point of view which is different from mine.
I think there is nothing about the gender. I mean, there's not even a formal statement to that effect. Yeah, I think that's a, I mean, yeah, even as a signal, I think you're right, there's nothing there. And there's, honestly, there's even that 6,000 rupee, whatever, that pregnant women scheme, that's already in place in
a pilot scheme.
And therefore, there's nothing, there's particularly nothing new there.
All right.
And even this, you said 31st was the kind of a mini budget presented, and some benefits for the senior citizens. And that looks like yet another, one more scheme, I mean, N+1 scheme of the LIC. So honestly, it's something very substantial to whether this the shock of demonetization, it doesn't appear to be the case. Yeah, therefore, I don't see anything there at all.
All right.
There is a, not to take away from your sense of, gender injustice in the budget, but I think there is a social scheme, which I don't know the Hindi word that is used for it, but it is basically the National Rural Livelihood Mission. And a part of it is very clearly for women self-help groups. And it's a fairly large scheme. It runs to several thousand crores. Now, what worries me about some of these schemes, ma'am, is we don't hear about it except at budget time. It was mentioned even in this budget. So I think the outlay was supposed to be 3,000 crores. It became 6,000 or something like that. But what is not clear is what happened what happened last year's 3,000 and what is happening now. Because if it is working, then it is certainly a very positive thing, at least for rural women. It is basically intended to allow them to set up, it's just the government's way of directly doing what all these, some of these microfinance institutions do and so on.
For your information, madam, the gender budget is 5.3% of the total budgetary outlay. I'm just giving you some statistics for whatever they're worth. Any other questions, any other comments from the audience? Okay, may I now, please sir, you're most welcome. Who are you asking this question to, sir?
I mean, in general.
Okay. Please speak into the microphone, sir.
You see, now they can sort of, if you are an individual, they can open up your income tax returns up to 10 years. Now imagine an ordinary person who could have changed his, the town in which he lives, could have changed the house in which he lives or the flat. Now to keep 10 years papers is a bit too much. I mean, somebody should take it up. Maybe the Chamber of Commerce should take it up.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Yes, sir. Mr. Parekh.
Just a clarification there. It's 7 years, not 10 years. No, it's always been 7 years, continues at 7 years, even in this budget. There's no such amendment. No. It's only for those taxpayers who have assets outside of India. And if they have not disclosed those assets, then the time limit of 7 years goes up to 16 years. But for any asset which is held in India, the time limit has historically been 7 years and continues to be so. Again, there are two sub-limits. If you already filed your tax return, and if the tax return has already been subjected to scrutiny or audit by the tax office, then there's a maximum time limit of 4 years for reopening. If a taxpayer has not filed the tax return at all, and in such cases, if some income is detected by the tax authorities, then the time limit is 7 years.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for the clarity.
Okay. I have a few questions, if nobody in the audience is asking a question. And a question maybe any one of you can, I mean, the question I have, the income tax concession that has been given to MSMEs, medium and small enterprises, with an annual turnover of below 50 crore rupees. Now, to what extent does this ignore the interconnectedness? The fact is that many of these small industrial units are linked to larger units. They're like ancillaries. And would this perhaps open a new avenue for evasion of corporate tax? This is a question I have. Yes, please.
I doubt whether it will open up any avenues for tax evasion. And the reason for that is the government has been smart enough to say that this limit of 50 crores is the number you need to look at the turnover for fiscal year 2015-16, which is already gone by. All the books are already closed. So there is hardly any ability to tamper with books for that year. They are not looking at the limit for the current fiscal year.
All right. A question I have for Mr. Govind Shankar Narayan on this housing schemes, the question is, how do you define affordable housing? I mean, you can have a two-core flat in Worli and that could be affordable housing too. But the inclusion of affordable housing in the definition of infrastructure to make it exempt from the provisions of the Land Acquisition Act. The decision to extend priority sector lending at subsidized rates of interest, cheap land, credit to builders, and you're including larger houses under the head of affordable housing. And you're also reducing the capital gains liability by bringing the base year forward from 1981 to 2001. To what extent will it actually encourage affordable housing? What extent will it encourage people to occupy houses which have already been constructed? We have an excess capacity there. And at the end of the day, how much gains will accrue to the house owner or the potential house owner, or how much would be appropriated by speculators? This is a question I have for you, sir.
I think, Paranta, you're covering a number of points in this question. Now, affordable housing, there is no very precise definition of what is affordable housing, but there is a very clear definition of what kind of affordable housing or what kind of housing qualifies for the subsidies the government gives. So the government gives subsidies for housing which is in certain areas as determined by the 2011 census. So these typically tend to be what I would call a tier 4 kind of town or an extended suburb of a large city. There is a size, as I mentioned, which could be 30 or 60 square meters or 45 or 90 square meters now after the budget. The person who gets this, who takes the loan for this, against which he gets a subsidy, should not have another house. Now, this is very difficult to prove in the Indian context because so they have to certify it. And he needs to have an income which I think is less than 3 lakhs. So now, if you put all of this together, other than in maybe a city like Bombay or in some other large metros, typically you end up saying that, you know, these are all places which cost between, say, 6 lakhs and 15 lakhs and meet these criteria. And then when they meet the criteria, you need to have a record of it, and then you file those records with the National Housing Bank, and they give you the subsidy for that. On your question with regard to capital gains, it's certainly attractive for people to, you know, to have that 2001 date as opposed to 1981. So it would help the secondary market rather than the primary market. So, you know, there may be people who now believe that they would like to buy a house you know, for selling, investment, and so on. One point I would make here is that housing is not, and I don't think the affordable housing space is not a money spinner in that sense for either the builder or for anyone else, nor must it be seen as a, you know, a way for people to make huge profits. Housing is typically, in most countries, utility-like. So in affordable housing, I don't think you would find people who would get into it for the purpose of making some huge investment gains and so on. This is not to say that this has not happened in the past, but the intent is for people to go in there and stay there.
Okay. Okay. We have one question. Yes, please, ma'am. Do speak into the microphone.
Sir, you said that demand is a problem. I understand. But what's your prescription? How could we raise demand? Because raising government expenditure is not the solution. And there also there's a problem, sir. What the government should look for, short run vis-a-vis long run. So, and another problem is that there are a lot of discussions with respect to budget, pre-budget, expectations were there, post-budget analysis were there. But it's not that sometimes I feel that if we could make a metric with which we can compare that, okay, we are this much far off, so we have to attain this. So can we make this kind of metric?
Okay, and madam, your name, please?
Okay, I'm Shumana Chaudhary from Durga Devi Sir of Management Studies.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Nagaraj, and if you are answering that question, I want to add a 2-bit to it. Who says 3% of fiscal deficit of GDP is the right figure? Or is it that this is somebody that Washington has told us it should be 3%, it should be 3.2%, it should be 3.5%. And here I would disagree with Dr. Roy, where he compared the budget of a household with the budget of a country. The difference in the budget of a country is, unlike a household, the government can print notes, you see, and the household cannot. Huh? So that, I think, is a crucial difference. So maybe you can take that question, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a, see, this is the standard argument. When the demand from the private sector is low, or, you know, it's always possible for the state to come in. I mean, this is the standard Keynesian economics. Okay, and then we know that in the private sector, the private corporate sector, as I mentioned earlier, was the engine of growth during the boom period. Okay, and now it is not in a position to do the same job. Okay, and we know that infrastructure shortages are there, and a large number of half-finished projects exist in infrastructure. We know it. And we all know railways are the huge, you know, I mean, a place where we have not invested. So it's a case where state can step in, and it has to, and in this process, given that our inflation is low, okay, there is no harm in violating the 3% budgetary norm, or 3.3% or 3.2%. In fact, this is what many economists have been saying, and there is nothing sacrosanct about the 3.2%. And also saying that we must reduce debt to GDP ratio. In fact, this is completely, this is what I said in economics, there are standard classical economists, what we call the orthodox economists. You say, look, government should live within its means. I mean, that's the basic idea. Government should live it within its means, and if you spend more, it will only lead to inflation, which means the existing economy is at full employment, which means that all the resources in the economy are reasonably fully used. At that situation, if you inject more money by the state, then it will only translate in inflation. But we are not in that situation today. We have a huge unemployment of resources. Our capital stock is underutilized. And more importantly, we have a huge deficit of infrastructure. No, if the government makes this investment, it will bring in private investment. I'll just give you a thought experiment. Imagine, even today, even with after we have this Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, even today, 40%, that is 2.4 lakh villages are not motorable at all, even today. Okay, and imagine that in next 2 years you connect all these villages. Imagine how many, right from cycles to mopeds to four-wheelers, the demand will grow. Which means the government investment brings in private investment. So the overall effect on the economy is going to be very high. And if your denominator grows, your debt to GDP ratio may not really grow high. Okay. Therefore, the notion that we must reduce fiscal the debt GDP ratio or stick to 3.2% or 3% fiscal deficit ratio is a self-imposed constraint which is not right at this stage. Okay, and that's the point. I'll give you an example with China. See, what did China do? China, of course, has China in 2008. Its debt to GDP ratio was about 150% of GDP. Today, its ratio is 260% of GDP. Did they face? Have they gone into a problem of inflation? Okay, has the economy collapsed? Okay, the issue is as long as the debt is our own. As Paranjay said, if the money is our own, it's a debt to collectively to ourselves. Okay, and therefore it is not an issue, provided it is not leading to inflation. Let's be very clear. If it leads to, therefore I think there is no harm in violating this rule, but bring in different kind of rules. I'm not saying simply print money and just throw it by a helicopter. I'm not saying that. Okay, I'm saying use it for specific purpose. See, if you print money, it should go for capital investment by the state. It has to. You have to build in rules. Okay, and it should not be for current consumption, but it should be for investment. So if you build in different rules and still print money, I do not see that we'll get into any problem. Okay, I give the example of China. Okay, China. Does anybody say that China will collapse? Okay, and of course they have the other problem. They have created excess infrastructure because their objective is to see that nobody is unemployed, because it's a political system where employment is very sensitive. Okay, so they have done it. Okay, so it's a clear case where even if you increase your debt to GDP ratio, but if the debt is to yourself, debt is in your own currency. Okay, and it need not be an issue. And therefore, I think it's a self-imposed constraint, and it comes from a certain view in economics. That's what I mentioned. See, the classical view feels that the state is a problem and not a solution, and therefore we must constrain it. And I feel need not be the case. In a situation of when when the aggregate demand is less, then the state can play a productive role. But of course, you have to have some rules to bind it. That's my answer.
Thank you, Professor Nagaraj, for explaining it so well. I think the point he's making is, say he talked about the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. It's not just the number of two-wheelers and cycles that. What about the ease of transportation of perishable commodities? Look at all the crowding in benefits as opposed to the crowding out. And as he rightly pointed out, I completely agree with him. It's not the deficit, but the quality of that deficit, how that money is spent. It's the same story with divestment. Are you borrowing are you selling the family silver, as they say, as James Callaghan used to say about Margaret Thatcher, to pay the butler? If you're going to sell the family silver for your daughter's education or to build an extension to your home, it can be justified. But when you start using it for your grocery bills, then you have a problem. So that's really the issue of divestment and strategic sales that we can talk about. But I won't dwell into this further. Dr. Roy, would you like to make, would these be your closing remarks too?
Maybe I can be the devil's advocate here.
Please, sir.
If you take China, its debt to GDP ratio is 250%. There is a flight of capital from China. It has come down by 1 trillion. The currency has started depreciating. At a time when we want money to come into India, for investment, when we want the credit rating agencies to keep our rating at a significantly high level, though they have not changed the rating till now, and so that our interest costs are lower. In fact, possibly our interest cost, even today, if we get it from outside, could be a little lower than getting it from the banks here, the bank's base rate. So in that type of a situation, if we keep increasing the debt and under some preconceived notion that it will lead to higher demand, then there is a major macroeconomic stability issue. And that's something which we need to keep in mind.
Mr. Parekh, would you like to say something by way of closing remarks?
The only remark I would make is from a tax perspective, well, it's been a mixed bag of outcome. There have been some favorable announcements, primarily as far as capital markets are concerned, as far as the real estate and housing sector is concerned. Other than that, nothing much in the budget for other sectors. Again, as far as individuals are concerned, there is a very, very limited relief provided to individuals in the slab rate of 2,50,000 to 5 lakh rupees, but with an additional surcharge of 10% for taxpayers between 50 lakhs to a crore. Nothing much for individuals to look up to in the budget. There certainly seems to be a drive towards the digital economy, more and more measures being announced and proposed in the budget itself to make cash transactions being more taxpayer unfriendly, additional taxes being imposed, penalties, interest and whatever. So there seems to be a drive towards digital economy. Some good measures for startup companies as we discussed in the course of the discussion. So that's something welcome. So this summarizes my take on the budget from a tax perspective.
Okay. Any of the panelists would like to add anything by way of closing remarks? Govindji?
I'll just react to the same point that that lady made and which they responded to. It is true that for over 70 years, there has been a lot of wasteful expenditure in budgets. And a lot of it has been lost through, corruption, institutional weakness, simply lack of using one's brains on where to spend money. But I think that no country can operate on the fundamental premise of pessimism. It has to believe that things will change. So although the Indian economy is fundamentally different from the Chinese economy in many ways, one of which is that we do not have an aligned common view of what success and what growth looks like. So every party and every individual's perspective of what is important to do is quite different. And to that extent, the outcomes that you will get out of budgetary investments in India will always be different from what you would get from China, which is top-down driven, and from Europe, which is completely homogeneous. So, where almost everyone fundamentally thinks the same way, they have broadly similar ideas about what economic growth represents. But we cannot, because the past happened to be, tax evaded and venal and all those things, say that the future will also be like that. So I would tend to agree that with what, Professor Nagaraj was saying, that the underinvestment in public services and social sector in India is actually mind-boggling. I think John Dries describes us as the world champions in underinvestment in social sector spending. So I think that's something which any country has to do. If we don't do this at some point, and some of it will get lost, then clearly the country is really headed nowhere. So if not this budget, hopefully in the next budget or subsequently, some government is going to have to significantly increase that. And that is going to also need fiscal deficits to expand well beyond this 3% number.
Professor Nagaraj, would you like to say something by way of closing remarks?
Yeah, I think we are only talking about budget. You see, in fact, let's face it, we have been talking, I mean, not, of course, we have forgotten recently, but we have we have got demographic dividend. We talked about, we have a window of democratic opportunity, okay, which will close in about 10, 15 years' time. Okay, and then unless we create infrastructure, both physical and social, okay, and let's face it, world over it is done by the state. Okay, unless we do it, I think it's going to become a demographic deluge. Okay, and therefore we should not see budget purely in terms of an accounting exercise or fiscal orthodoxy, but it should be seen, look, what are you doing with this money, keeping in view this window of opportunity we have. If we don't do it, there is no way India is going to catch up with China or any other country. Okay, India will remain underdeveloped for a very long time to come. Okay, I'm not just making a grand statement, but if you look at hard, I can do the arithmetic. Okay, therefore, this is an opportunity because this will close. And if uneducated, unemployed workforce is a social bomb, okay, and it's going to create more problems. Okay, so unless state is foresighted, okay, or the ruling class, okay, is foresighted to use this, okay, for productively, using the instruments of state carefully. Okay, otherwise, fiscal orthodoxy can prove extremely disastrous socially.
Okay. Dr. Roy, would you like to say anything by way of closing remarks?
See, there is one thing that we are talking about, that is employment. It's gone.
It's okay, sir.
In fact, it's worse than...
No. It's all right.
It's all right. Yeah. There is this question of taking advantage of this demographic dividend, which essentially means at the end of the day, you have to skill the people and create employment. Now, when it comes to employment, we need to keep in mind some of the standard things that we have in mind, like building roads is going to create employment. And that's why we should focus on road building. But you look at the technology which was there 10 years back and what's the technology today. It's no longer a basket and pickaxe and shovel sort of driven road building. It's a excavator, it's a earth moving machine, and sort of other sort of road rollers based road making. Now, for the economists of this country who work on these labor coefficients, etc., their all data is antiquated. If you look at the input-output table which the country has got, it was last updated in 2007-8. And in fact, the labor coefficients possibly have not got updated after 2003-4. So if that is the kind of situation, in fact, some of the coefficients are of 3-4, and then they have done the pricing adjustment and the 7-8. So this is the type of background material which used for saying that there will be great growth in employment. So we have to possibly think afresh and see what are the other sectors which can give us employment, maybe in services, maybe in logistics services, the courier services and other things which have grown, or healthcare may be another area, etc., which will give us employment. So it is not just to say we have to create employment, we have to see which sectors are going to create that going to provide that employment. And once we know the sectors, then we know what kind of skills we will need for those sectors. So possibly a lot more detailed work needs to be done before we just put in some gross numbers over there.
All right. Anything else, Parekh Saab? Okay. Thank you very much. It's been my honor, my privilege to moderate this discussion. And my throat hasn't been in good shape, so I hope you'll excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Himanshu Parekh, Dr. Siddhartha Roy, Professor Nagaraj, Mr. Govind Shankar Narayan. And it's time for me to hand over proceedings to Mr. Vijay Srirangan. Thank you once again.
With the permission of the moderator and the panelists and yourself, I penned a few lines while listening to all the discussions that were taking place. Please forgive me if I read those lines out. The views are my own, not the Chamber's. The lines are titled, A Taxing Budget. Do I have enough budget? I often ask myself. Varied views and concerns is what I get, adding worry to oneself. Economists and academicians alike appear negative or neutral at best. So I wonder if I will get that hike. Yes, this budget is under test. And yet, I am of the belief about the positive intent. Despite all the hype and disbelief, I continue to look for that positive dent. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Mr. Ashok Bharat to give the concluding valedictory session and vote of thanks. Mr. Bharat.
Thank you, Vijay. But I'll start with an apology. I'm not going to oblige you by giving you an address, addressing this audience, because I have to leave and I'm already late. But having said that, the only concluding remark that I'd like to make is I am feeling very happy at the end of this session for a very perverse reason. And that is, I'm 60 years old and I suddenly realized that for the last 56 of them, I lived in a perfect world. And it's only in the last 3 years that imperfection has crept in. So I don't have too many years to live anymore, so I don't think I'll have to suffer what many other youngsters in this room, if this is the kind of pessimism that is prevalent in this room. So it's a perverse kind of a happiness, which I must share. And I can only say that whilst we keep on complaining about these things, we never look at ourselves. When we point a finger at somebody else, three fingers point at us. What about our own character? The first thing when we say that 2,000 rupees is what the minimum, our first reaction is somebody will, break it up into 2,000, because that's our mind, the way our mind works. If we do not have the basic character to say, fine, whatever has been done may not be perfect, but at least I will try and comply with it in letter and in spirit. It's, a story my mother once told me was there was a famine in the village. And the king, who was a very benevolent king, there were a lot of children who were dying because there was no milk. And the king, who was very benevolent, he said, what you should do is, there is this well which is dried up. Everybody who has a cow, why don't you put a bucket of milk into that? So in the morning, there will be a lot of milk, and those who do not have cows, their children can drink milk. And you do it in the night. Next morning, when they got up, they found that it was full of water. Because everyone thought that, wo to doodh dega, main pani mila deta hu. This is the problem. Our education system is neither teaching skills, nor is it teaching values. I remember as a student, after lunch, the first thing I studied in a Roman Catholic school, we had to study moral science. It was a drudgery to sit through that afternoon, but there are a lot of little lessons there which have stood by me in the most difficult periods of my life. They left an indelible impression. All that has disappeared. We are only in physics, chemistry, maths, cognitive sciences. There is no function of values in our education system. So even if you create the most perfect law, even if you say 0 rupees is allowed as a political donation, everything has to be in check, we will find a way. We will create a parallel set of accounts. Instead of 9 Akbar Road, it will be kept at 17 Akbar Road or 14 Aurangzeb Road, and there will be a parallel set of accounts, a parallel political party as accounts which will be running, because that's the destruction of our character. It is this social fragility that frightens me. Any kind of economic development without a social foundation of strength and character is bound for destruction. And that is something that we never talk about. We only get worried about 5% surcharge and 17.5% GDP outlay. That's what it is. And I think we need to have a very serious reflection on that. With that, anyway, I have to leave. So thank you very much for being here. It's very generous of you to have, and gracious of you to have spent so much of time, particularly the panelists and the very distinguished people on the dais, and all the distinguished people in the audience. We hope to have such conferences again in the near future, and on some occasion or the other, and I'm hopeful that all of you will join us on these occasions. I also thank the management of the Royal Bombay Yacht Club for offering this facility. They have been very efficient supporters of our chamber. So God bless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, esteemed panelists. Now I would like to request our Director General, Sri Vijay Srirangan, to present memento to our esteemed panelists and speakers, please.